that, let's say like in gold, you can't really see or tell what you really have. Like you can't say, oh, it's 1 ounce per ton versus 6 ounces per ton, which would be amazing. But you can't really see that. You need the results for that. But in lithium, if you have a spodumene, core sample that comes out with a trained eye, a geologist with a trained eye, or a person that's got trained, can pretty much tell, I mean, that they have something significant or not. So you don't really have to wait for the essays to really tell you that, but the essays will give you like numbers, percentages. Is this correct?
Between plays, it's the journey and what you do between where you are and where you want to be. Research, prepare, plan, and execute your strategy. Do your DD and stay strong in visualizing and achieving your goals. Our strategy is unique since 2020. An original concept imitated, never duplicated. Real conversations with media influencers, educational and expert speakers, analysts and consultants. Between Plays, bridging the gap between companies and investors.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Between Plays Stock Market Strategies. All right, so we have a treat for everyone today. We have Monsieur Eric Lemieux here with us today, professional geologist, and of course, independent, mining analyst. How are you doing today, Eric?
Doing fine. Thank you very much, Albert. Yeah, maybe just quickly introduce myself. I'm a little bit known for certain people, and maybe more on the Quebec side or the Canadian exploration industry. But I say independent mining analyst, where I have a background as a geologist, trained, schooled in Quebec City, Université Laval, did a bachelor's, did a master's degree, and then started to work for industry a little bit. SOCAM, which is the Quebec Crown Corporation, which I always said it's the training school of Quebec geologists. But long story short, I decided to go do a PhD at Queen's University in mineral economics with Professor Brian McKenzie, and that was just because I had more of interest when I was running a drill to understand, why am I looking for copper? And I got interested by the sort of the macro side of our industry, macroeconomic side of our industry. So long story short is I got a second master's degree in mineral economics at the Carlos School of Mines. Never finished my PhD, but lo and behold, this is back in '97, and we had the BRIEX event, and I joined the Montreal Exchange as their geologist, and then I worked for the Quebec Securities Commission. And decades later, I got called by a senior VP of Laurentian Bank Securities, who had got my name through different outlets and the grapevines of our industry, and I became a mining analyst on the sales side, and that's what I've been doing now for more than perhaps 10 years now, where I'm a mining analyst. I've sort of muted now from the sales side to being an independent, and maybe a sort of a black sheep, where I sort of give my opinions to in certain files, and I do follow certain companies, which I always said, I try to follow good stories where I think I can bring an added value to the exploration story or to the company. So that's in a nutshell who I am, and it's a pleasure for me to discuss with you different subjects today in our industry, and maybe initially focus on a broader level of stuff, but eventually, yes, like I said, I consider myself an expert on what's going on in Quebec, for better or for worse. But I will probably delve into later on. But there's interesting stuff going on in Quebec, both on sort of the mining economic side, but also on the geology side, and that all sort of interreacts together sometimes.
That's very interesting. Actually, that's a really great background for you to have. So naturally, the people that are listening to this today, I mean, the amount of knowledge that you bring is extremely important, especially to like the everyday retail investor. And you know what, even those that have experience in investment strategies and just trading, it doesn't mean that they know what's going on with the rocks and what's going on with the essays. And I say all of this because naturally, look, I met you at the Puma exploration site. I just want to mention that. And yeah, Matt, you blew me away, because the amount of knowledge that you had, and you took the time to teach me like certain aspects of like where the quartz, look at this, if there's too much quartz, that's not really good thing if you're looking for something else, and all these things. And I was just attentively just soaking this up and going, my God, this guy knows so much. And I was like, I have to have him on the show. So thank you for coming on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I guess just to make reference to everybody, that's Puma Exploration, which was the Williams Brook project in New Brunswick. And what's interesting with that is it's part of the Appalachians, if you want, which ties in a little bit to Quebec, which is something that eventually we'll probably have a chance, Albert, to talk about a little more details. But if Quebec is well regarded, in part is because of its underlying geology. And I don't want to get into too much details right now, but yes, I mean it's a pleasure for me when I can sort of give a little bit of partake a little bit of my knowledge to different people. And you mentioned the site visit. One thing I was going to mention is that unfortunately, since COVID, I've done a lot less site visits, but I always tell people that for me as an analyst, it's probably the most important thing, because that's where, beyond just understanding the specifics or the details of the geology and what's going on with the project, it's really where you get the feel to know the people. And I always said, it's nice to know the CEOs, which are the generals leading the army.
Yes.
But I appreciate meeting the soldiers and meeting the people on the field who are actually doing the work. Obviously, sometimes with site visits at high level, you don't necessarily see everybody that's working there. But I always say site visits to me as a mining analyst is a critical element, and it's most important. And yes, unfortunately, if I extend beyond the COVID-19 situation, unfortunately here in Quebec this summer, there were the forest fires, and I think that played in part where for a time being it was in northern Quebec with the James Bay area, and then it went down, or I should say at the same time or almost right after, it was in the Abitibi. So it unfortunately made my summer 2023 very barren in terms of site visits, but it is what it is, and that's things that we cannot control
Yeah.
in our life
So
that we
true.
live today.
So true. And I mean, like, definitely the COVID whole situation, pray that we don't have anything like that, happen again. And hopefully a few
Oh, never again.
generations
Yes.
lifetime, because it took a toll on all the kids. It took a toll on everybody. And it's just was a very unhealthy environment. But that being said, what I think that you brought up, which was really interesting, is the Appalachian Mountains. Now, bringing that up, I mean, you had, when we were on site, which you were like, you understand you're on the structure of the Appalachian Mountains, and in terms of geology, how important it is and stuff like that. And you were talking about how it continues to go north, going through I guess the Atlantic Ocean or the Arctic, up in that
Yeah,
region.
it goes off to Newfoundland.
Yes,
And what's interesting with Newfoundland is that the last 2 3 years there's been some very interesting projects, Newfound Gold, Marathon Gold, and so there's been a sort of this little resurgence of exploration in Newfoundland, and with people's realization that hey, there's great endowment there, and there's some reasons we sometimes can explain why. And I'll just make a little parenthesis really
yeah,
quickly, is that Newfoundland was controlled by the forestry companies, or a few big players, and so you didn't necessarily have all these small little players that were able to advance little projects here and there, because the land was mostly controlled by Irving or big forestry companies, and it's same thing a little bit with New Brunswick. So that sometimes offers opportunities, which is case by case in jurisdictions. But to get back to the geology, indeed, when we talk about the Appalachians, it starts in South Carolina, goes all through the eastern U.S. Not, I shouldn't say the seaboard, but proximal to that. Upper state New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, goes off into Quebec, New Brunswick, part of Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. And yes, because of plate tectonics, there's some rocks of that age, which were a little bit less than 500 million years of age, that continue on the Irish side and
crazy,
into Scotland and then into Norway and into Sweden, which we call the Fino-Scandinavian Shield. And
crazy.
so it is fascinating as a geologist when you start to understand a little more details of geology, and even the people that are not that aware. But when you look at sort of simplified maps, you can see these big, these stone belts, rock stone belts, greenstone belts, and et cetera, the Appalachian belt that continue. And for the example in this particular case, is just because the Atlantic Ocean, which is a more recent event, opened up and separated us from Europe. So it's interesting
It's
to see
very,
some analogies, and sometimes it's interesting because what goes on in Ireland sometimes can have some repercussions here, to look at stuff through a different angle and say, hey, maybe this reminds us of some Irish geology or Scottish geology or some stuff that's going up in Norway.
That's really interesting. So when we're talking about rocks, then, um, and we look at Quebec, uh, let's say, because there's been a lot of talk, about Quebec, trying to, they're investing billions into the whole lithium space, and
Or the critical metals.
yeah, that's right, the critical metals, exactly. Thank you for correcting that, because it's true. It's the critical metals space, and when you really look at that, like, um, I mean, I've seen some companies talk about having scandium in hard rock, and then you have igneous rocks for phosphate, and which is cleaner than let's say stuff that's going on in the rest of the world. And then you have it's like we have so many different types of quality critical minerals. Um, like, can you expand on that a little bit, and why
Well,
maybe?
sure, Albert, it makes me expand in the sense that, when we mentioned, like, for example, phosphate or apatite, apatite is one of the hard rock minerals that contains the phosphate. And this is part of the LFB battery sort of infrastructure. L for lithium, and um, the LFF is for iron, and P is for the phosphate. But what I was going to say is that, we've got different types of deposits. It can be magmatic, it can be sedimentary. And I don't want to hit on the head of other jurisdictions, but sometimes, for example, jurisdiction has more sedimentary endowment um, in terms of potential. And I give the example of lithium in this particular case, where, um, as you know, the brines in South America were very popular for lithium.
Yes.
But then there
Oh,
was this
yeah, big time.
realization that for lithium, was it necessarily in the scope of ESG and the greening of our economy um, valid to say, well, we're going to go and get out the brine waters in a
Yes.
desert environment, evaporate it, recover the lithium. It just was hard to sort of, on the ESG perspective, to sort of validate that and accept that. And so
Yeah.
that sort of gave a second, or a new sort of breath for the hard rock. But this changes. And so, like I say, sometimes you never say never to something, because it might arise in terms of a commodity, specific commodity, or sometimes sort of a mining method, that this will turn out to be more of goût du jour, if you want.
Yeah, of
And
course.
so, for getting back to
Exactly.
the lithium, this gave an occasion for the hard rock lithium deposits to maybe re-arise in terms of their endowment and in terms of their interests.
Yes.
And so, Quebec, in that regards, for the hard rock now, is more and more in the spotlight, because we do have a type of geology with our different geological provinces that could be of interest and be very keen or endowed for lithium,
Yeah,
for spodumene.
and it's true though, because I mean, I think that the lithium spot price must have something to do with that, because when you look at the lithium spot price when it was really low, I mean, let's say 2019, for example, I mean, companies like Nemaska was having a very hard time because it just because the margins weren't there, right? I mean, it's like, well, how are we going to make money on this, right? And these big companies were, going bankrupt for whatever reasons. I'm sure that played a part in it.
Oh, for
Um,
sure. And that's something in our mining industry, is something that's one of the biggest challenges, is this external factor of we don't control the price, and the price has so many variables, and we're dealing with a commodity that we have to go and get, where we have fixed cost. It's fixed in location,
yeah,
because effectively a mine, you can't just say, well, look, we're just going to move it up to another jurisdiction where we're going to get a better price or whatever.
no,
It's fixed in location, fixed in size, fixed in, well, I should say it's variable in quality. And this just adds this sort of specific challenges, if you want, sometimes.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's why you're saying that sometimes, the eau de jour, I mean, this can play even on the lithium spot price, because if it drops down to a certain level, well, the salars, even though the ESG might not be so great, but because they have higher margins, I would believe, than the spodumene deposits, because I guess to do a mine and all this kind of stuff, there must be more cost to it. So then the salars can become like popular again, because it's not like they really had such a hard time in 2019 as massive companies like Nemaska did, right?
You're totally right. I mean, that could happen, but also on the other side is, once these mines are established in a jurisdiction, and you can see that you have a long life. Sometimes there's these economies of scale, and there's these economies of labor relations and
Yes.
sort of a
Geopolitical
history where,
landscapes.
well, you'll be able to weather the storms.
Yes.
And
Oh yeah.
so, if you have a hard rock mine in northern Quebec, but if it's established, it might be able to survive.
It's true.
Um,
Yeah.
and so, for better or for worse, even though it would be cheaper to do it maybe some other jurisdiction, just because you've got this historical background, they'll be able to weather a storm and continue to produce. And
And
this
that,
is reminds me a
yeah.
little bit of the iron ore. And this is something where I think hopefully the governments will come to realization that, if you build the infrastructure to go and develop a certain region, don't remove it right away. And here I make specific reference to the train tracks. Back in the 1940s, 50s, I think it's more in the 1950s with Duplessis. Yes, he opened up the iron ore to the Americans, and it was big American companies that came and built stuff in Quebec. And I know that was sort of this foi that sort of developed because we were saying we're selling our resources to the Americans. But
Yeah.
it took the capital to do it. It took the know-how to do it. They did it in northern Minnesota. They did it in I would say the Mississippi Valley in part, and they came and do it into the Labrador, Shefferville and Fermont. But what I was going to say about my comment there is that when I was a young geologist, I worked up there, um, and in part it was paid by, or the Quebec government obliged the big iron ore companies to reinvest monies because they were closing off the iron ore industry because
Okay.
we were just northern Quebec was just not competitive anymore because the iron ore price had gone down so much. But thank God they didn't remove the railway infrastructure because 10 years later or 15 years later, just because the world economy just changed and we needed more iron, well, the iron price went up and Quebec just became refocused or became the spotlight again for iron ore. So it just shows you that you just sometimes have to have this sort of long-term perspective and never close the door entirely because what's waste one day might become somebody's treasure in another day. So that's not to be forgotten. So this is a practical example of having this sort of long-term perspective in things. And once you establish an operation, if it's well done, I think you can weather any storm. And hopefully the infrastructure that the government might contribute, well, we'll see it as an investment in the long term for all parties. And not just like some journalists used to say, or said, la route qui s'en va nulle part, the road that goes nowhere, when they
Uh,
made reference to the Route 167 that went
okay.
to the Renard mine. And I know the Renard diamond mine was not necessarily a big success, but again, here you have to put things in proper context. And I think Albert, you mentioned it earlier on about, when the commodity price goes down, it's just too bad, but it hits everybody, and you have to sort of, readjust yourself.
Yeah.
And it happens with the diamonds also, unfortunately, or
And
as
yeah.
much as we say diamonds are forever and it's the girl's best friend, there is fluctuations even in diamonds.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. You brought up something that I started laughing, like smiling immediately when you're talking about like something becoming waste, but with a long-term perspective, maybe it becomes gold or something, whatever, or
Or
white
somebody's
gold.
treasure.
And
Exactly.
but I'm making reference to pegmatites back in the day, like pegmatites back in the day. I'm sure like geologists and whoever had run across them really didn't really care that much about them. They were just what is this, another pegmatite, like who cares? Whereas
Well, SOS, which in our notebooks meant, same old shit. And, it's when you were doing your mapping, pegmatites were not necessarily of interest in a sense that if you were looking for base metals, which was, the copper, the zinc, the the cobalt, lithium was not necessarily something that there was a certain interest, but it was just not something that, it was not a hard rock. And it was not a base metal. It was not definitely not a precious metals
no.
as gold and silver. So it was something that was sort of an interesting geological footnote, but it was not something that most companies and geologists were looking for just because there was the 1960s, the lithium industry was much more loose used for lubricants and for the windows and the
Glass industry too.
corning walls and and
Yeah,
and
that's it. Yeah.
and the sort of specialized little part. And I guess as we mentioned before, I mean it was industrial minerals, and industrial minerals usually was not necessarily the discovering them and finding them. It was more the marketing aspect of things. So yes, pegmatites was not something that we were thrilled about. And I think I had mentioned that's what probably made you smile is that, for pegmatites, because associated with quartz,
Yes.
they were usually sort of positive um, relief, as opposed to gold and precious metals were associated with shear zones, alteration zones, and that was usually more scrubbed off. It was more eroded. So
Okay.
usually the idea was that, you would find gold in a swamp, very hard to find, and the pegmatites were always sort of outcropping. And so the idea was, if you were sort of a lazy geologist, well, you just sort of walked where the outcrops were, and it was most of the times pegmatites, and so it was SOS, and you tell your boss, well, I didn't see anything interesting. But if you were, really to go down the swamps or by the border of the swamps and dig with your grub, you might be able to find stuff. But anyways, as I told you, most of the times pegmatites was a nice place to go and have our number two, because you were up in the winds and you weren't exposed to the flies, which God knows, if you work in the northern Quebec, there's a lot of flies there. So it's a
I,
running gag,
I
but it
love that
just gets
story.
back to
I
this
love that
idea
gag.
that how things can change. And never would I have thought in my early career that, pegmatites would become important. And so much the better. It just shows you that, in geology, you got to respect the periodic table, because
It's
any element can turn out to be very important. And we saw it, 10 years ago with rare earths. I mean, before that, you know, rare earths were rare earths because they were rare, but they weren't necessarily rare, but they were just called rare because there was not very much of interest. But we realized with the booming economy and the change of our economy, that we needed these sort of critical metals. And it just shows you that our society is evolving, which is a good sign.
yeah, it's crazy because it's true what you're saying. Like, at one time it wasn't, really that important, and then now look, it's like a whole chapter into this whole new industry. I mean, whether it's, we're heading towards solid state batteries, whether it's the LFP, LFMP, lithium ion batteries itself. I mean, lithium is a key player, and it's weird because you're saying it's like, who would have thought that it would have become, so important. I mean, making even critical mineral lists.
Yeah.
It's part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well,
It's part of
yeah, it's our
the
changing society, and our society is evolving, and metals that we didn't think we needed in the past are the ones we probably need for the future, and that will also change too. And I'm also tell people that lithium is very interesting right now. I think it has um, a good future, but who knows in 10 years from now if
true.
they'll be able to make batteries out of with sodium. And then if we look at the oceans, we have salt water there, and we might have a huge quantity of available sodium. Now, obviously, it all becomes also a question of energy, and what the cost to go get these different elements. But what I'm trying to say is that it's something that's always in movement, and in French we say mouvance.
Yeah.
It's something that is not. There's no static one in mineral
Yeah, it's
exploration.
fluid.
There's not at all.
It's always ever moving. I mean,
Yeah.
that's technology for us, right? I mean, if we look back, if we go back 2,000 years ago, I mean, a regular person, I would guess, we can say lives better than a king back in those days. I mean, we have our value, homes, heating, electricity, So if you, yeah, so you're right. Everything's always ever changing. I have something that's a really interesting question, because this was something that was mentioned in an interview I did not too long ago. And a CEO was stating that, there's a difference between, let's say you pull out a carrot, you pull out a core, okay, sample. That, let's say, like in gold, you can't really see or tell what you really have. Like, you can't say, oh, it's 1 ounce per ton versus 6 ounces per ton, which would be amazing. But you can't really see that. You need the results for that. But in lithium, if you have a spodumene, core sample that comes out with a trained eye, a geologist with a trained eye, or a person that's there that's got train, can pretty much tell, I mean, that they have something significant or not. So you don't really have to wait for the essays to really tell you that, but the essays will give you like numbers, percentages. Is this
I
correct in
think,
any way?
yeah, I think Albert, yes, because it gets back to what I mentioned about industrial minerals, where industrial minerals is usually a commodity that is part of our industrial use,
Okay.
um, but it's something that is not necessarily always hard to find. It's more the marketing aspect. And so, in terms of getting to the lithium, yes, a trained eye can have sort of a observe the spodumene, and you can say, well, this is the spodumene that I have, big crystals, and it, composes maybe 60% of the core. And there's a little bit of quartz, there's maybe a little bit of muscovite, some other materials, but we can recognize the spodumene crystals, and that should have the lithium in it. And you sort of have a sort of a rule of thumb that you can say, well, this is maybe like 1.3% lithium. So as opposed to the precious metals, where in particular gold, yes, gold is by itself a Pandora box, because you could always think that you have a good alteration system. You've got visible gold, you've got that sort of Saracite alteration. Everything's really interesting, but God knows that you've got to wait for the assays, because how many times we've been fooled about, you expected maybe a 5 grams, and it came out to 0.5, and sometimes you get a surprise, it's 50 grams, and you look at the core, and I would have never expected there was that much gold into it, but it was sort of intermingled with fine specks of isonopride or whatever. So yes, you're right to say that with pegmatites, you can sort of have an idea when there's the spodumene contact, and it gives you a sort of an idea. So you can have it's more quick to be able to say, hey, this is maybe good and maybe this is not good. And you don't have to wait till all you have all your assays. So that's sort of a little element that differentiates, if you want, between precious metals and industrial minerals, where not necessarily say it's easier, but it just partakes itself more quickly to be able to define some deposit. And we see it right now where, I look at examples where, after 2 years of exploring, they come out with a resource number in terms of their pegmatite and their lithium content, as opposed to a gold deposit. It takes 5, 7 years to define a resource, because you've got all the assays and all the drilling you have to do in definition, and it's usually a little bit more complicated. Rule of thumb, I think that's something that I think you can sort of foresee and say yes.
You see, this is why I love having these conversations, because you learn so much. Like the whole 5 to 7 years to be able to establish that, I didn't even know that. So
Yeah, I mean, I would say on a rule of thumb, for gold mining companies, when you start with an exploration project, to come up to a resource estimate, I mean, there's some projects you can do it in 4 to 5 years, but 2 years, 3 years of drilling is a minimum, before you
oh,
even
that's interesting.
contemplate a resource estimate, as opposed to a lithium. You can maybe in a year, from an exploration success with a lot of good drilling and a lot of knowledge, be able to define a resource estimate. And again, this is, I'm making general rules,
Yes, of course.
and I'm inferring that there's a good team with good geologists there, and they're knowing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's something that you mentioned about the history of mankind. We've always needed metals, yes, that's for sure.
Yes.
I just sort of chuckle because I think gold has always had its allure, and it's in a sense way
Since
back into the
yeah.
beginning of man, if you
Yeah, I
want, and
guess so.
it's just
Yeah.
always had that sort of a historical perspective. But we've always needed commodities, and I think that's something that there's this expression: if you can't grow it, you've got to mine it.
It's true.
And I know it's sort of a tongue in cheek sometimes that you could say that to people that are strong on the environmental side, but it's a reality. If you cannot grow something, you probably have to mine it, and that's something that people have to be cognizant that mining has had its history, and it will have its future.
It's true, because no matter what we use today, whether it's this microphone, whether it's your cell phone that you hold in your hand, people right now they're watching this, whether it's on their laptop, their iPad, computer screen, tablets, phones, Androids. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, all of this comes from mining. It comes from some basic element, right?
For
So, I mean,
sure.
it's like you said,
And
if
God
we can't.
knows that our instruments today need a lot of different materials.
Yes. Oh,
And
yes.
when we mention a car, okay, well, a car, you've got the aluminum, you've got the iron elements, you've got the copper wiring a little bit, but a fuel, I should say, a gas car, has a certain amount of metals.
Yes.
But if you look at an electrical car, there's much more of a complexity, 4 times more copper. You've got cobalt, you've got nickel because you've got the batteries, you've got all these sort of electronic aspects a little bit more
Yes.
specialized. I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable in terms of EVs and electrical vehicles, but I see with Tesla, the huge screen and the interrelation
Yeah.
with your interaction with your telephone. And it's
Yes.
remarkable. And I think, it's the way of the future, highly likely.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And there'll be differences in terms of the types of batteries, but yes, it's the main important thing is that as we progress with society, evolution, we need more and more commodities. And this is going to be that duality between the need of the metals and protecting the environment. But I still think that there's a way of combining this in a balanced way. And I know that the mining industry has improved a lot.
Yes.
And, when I see certain people make comments or have this sort of information, I always say people take the time to really understand what's going on there because sometimes there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of bad things that are blamed on the mining industry, and it's not full of reality sometimes. And hopefully and thankfully, I think pegmatite mining, lithium mining is something that's rather clean because with the type of deposit, there's usually, you've got your lithium and there's very little deleterious end products or byproducts that are, or I should say end products that are associated with because of like quartz, mica, and some other low elements, but nothing of acid generation or radioactive. And so most of the times these type of deposits will be quite clean. And so you have to sort of see it as a quarry. Basically, when we build roads, we go get the granite and we break it up and we make other little stones that we can use in our roads. I'm very simplifying the stuff, but I'm just trying to give an impression to people that, you know, some of the mining of the materials we need today are much less polluting than probably the base metals of the past where we needed to get it, but with our processing had a lot of environmental impact.
Yeah, and we're more aware of these types of factors too, right? I mean, time, we like to say that humanity has evolved, but time, in terms of technology, we at least try to bring new solutions, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And yeah, and try to bring things to this other level where we're not having the effects that we once had, because we're more aware. We do have all these new technologies too. Like, we got satellites in the sky and we look down now and we're able to see, oh, well, look at what this had done in the past. We cannot do that anymore. We need to make sure that the future that we do things this way instead. So absolutely, I think so. And without mining, I mean, the I call it the new age digitization, electrification age. I mean, that's coming. I mean, and like you're saying with the cars, the EV space, absolutely. I mean, when you look at, let's say, Apple, for example, making deals with a company called Global Star, GSAT. I mean, I could take my Apple phone and I can go up where I won't get any reception. And then all of a sudden you'll see a little satellite come on in a corner now. And you can only pretty much use it for 911s and stuff like that. But still, I mean, it's a great location device. And if you're stuck somewhere, and you can use 911 and have your phone being pinged, what more do you need? You're not alone anymore, out in the middle of
Oh,
nowhere. It's a
it's
huge.
incredible because it reminds me of my when I started off my career as a young
Oh
geologist.
yeah, like you're alone out there.
It was by radio frequency, and it was, my second year I worked up in the Nunavik up in northern Quebec, and it was through Bell Frobisher, and it was radio, and everybody was using the radio wave, and you could hear every conversation. And so you had the Inuit calling to the other village who was talking maybe with his wife or his mother, and they were talking in Inuktitut. And then, somebody in my camp needed to call their family. And so you could just have this, and it was kind of amusing because you had this sort of vortex of conversations going on all through the radio waves. But it was, hi Albert, how are you? Over.
Yeah.
10-4 over, and it was just this communication.
Yeah.
But it was all, it was multi-users, but it
Yeah.
went through Frobisher Bay, which is, north of Quebec and the Baffin Island, and the other one was Belle Alma, which is in the Lac Saint Jean area. And I remember those two main radio beacons, and it was limited access. And so when you had an incident, it was like priority because somebody just said, "Hey, we had an incident," and so the radio waves were reserved for him. And things got done, but it was much more complicated. And it
Yes.
just shows you the evolution of a lifestyle. And you were mentioning about technology, but and I'm making an analogy with the mining industry. 60 years ago or more, my great grandparents, well, we didn't have phones, they didn't have TVs, and we didn't have any running waters. And we had the outhouse
Yeah.
where people did you know their human the
Needs.
showers, if you want.
Yeah, exactly.
And we didn't have that environmental perspective. But if you had a hole in the ground behind your house, that was where you did your needed stuff.
Yeah.
Now today we have much more bigger population. We're more localized in municipalities. We have to have these water treatment plants, the sewage plants, and it's also for the garbage. And I still recall when I was mapping stuff up northern, well, maybe not northern Quebec, but midway Quebec, where sometimes you hit these dumps, and there was a lot of cans and old stuff. But that was part of the tradition back then, where people, their garbage was basically thrown at the end of their land plot.
Yes, absolutely.
And
And
so we've improved a lot, but when
oh,
we blame mining industry for stuff that was done back in the 60s or the 1940s, we just have to recall that back then we didn't have sort of the same lifestyle. We threw our garbage at the end of our land plot. We did our number ones and number twos behind the lot. So it just shows you that we're evolving, and I think we're
yes.
evolving in a positive way, and hopefully mining has a contribution to actually even more improve. And so that's where I have, I'm optimistic that yes, when I go on the field, I see the interest for the geology on a more local scale and a more, global scale. But I'm always saying to myself, we're there to sort of maintain a capacity of finding new minerals and making sure that we can plan our society in a positive way. But I just want to get back to what we initially talked about. I'm very Quebec focused in part,
Yeah.
but I still think that Quebec has a wonderful geology by its inherent geological um, acumen, if you want, or I'm not too sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, but what I want to highlight is that Quebec is very well positioned. We have a government that is rather proactive. It's not all perfect, but then we have the Quebec government has civil servants that are doing the mapping. We
Yes.
have
Northvolt,
CGL,
the
which is
big the Northvolt
tech
deal is
platform where
huge.
you can get the geological information. So, and this, I just wanted to make a little parenthesis that there's been a lot of naysayers saying that our claim, our allocation of mineral rights is flawed. And I tell people, well, if you go into other jurisdictions, yes, maybe there's a higher price to pay for the permit. But if you go and ask for $1 million for a permit to do exploration in an area and there's no success, there's likely a chance that the government won't be able to get another $1 million for that same claims. And to have public access where anybody can go and get the claim, which is sort of this what we call the free mining, it has a certain more of a democratic aspect to it. Maybe sometimes it's less payable to our democracy, but it's accessible to our democracy. And here I make reference a little bit like Nevada, where the state doesn't control it; it's more consultants that control the geological information, and so the companies will pay a big price. But it's not easy for anybody. It takes a company that has a lot of money that's willing to shut out the money to certain individuals,
Nevada or
as opposed to
Namaska?
here. Pardon me?
Nevada or Namaska? You were saying
Nevada.
Nevada. Okay, so
Yeah, I'm
Nevada. Okay.
talking about jurisdictions. I'm
Oh,
not
okay,
going into
jurisdictions.
details.
Okay, because there's a company
Yeah,
called Nevada.
I,
Okay,
I
so
mentioned
jurisdictions.
Nevada.
Yes.
Namaska
Okay.
is the company that was initially, and this is something that we talked
Yeah,
about a
Nevada.
lot,
The
Albert,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is
Okay.
it's a sad story where you mentioned about when you don't control the price of the commodity. Yes, when there's price fluctuations, and for Namaska, it was just a question of bad timing. They had their
Yeah.
project back, I think, in 2008. They advanced it. They thought that maybe in 2012 there was a window of opportunity, but that window of opportunity with the lithium prices closed off in 2014,
Yeah.
2015, and unfortunately they had a bad window or a bad winds in the bad direction,
Yeah.
so they weren't success. And it gets back to what I was mentioning about never say never, and sometimes there's periods where it's more difficult. But I always tell people it's a bit like there's storms. You've got the
Yeah.
rain, you've got the wind, there's damage, but most of the times the sun will come back and there'll be a better period.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm just curious about something, because when we spoke a lot about the different areas, we were mentioning about the democratic type stuff. People were saying stuff about Quebec, and then we brought up the state of Nevada and stuff like that. The James Bay Area, the James Bay Area. I mean, it's look, the world is looking at the James Bay Area. I mean, I have some friends that live out in Australia, and they're talking about the James Bay Area, and that's from Australia. They're not just talking about Canada; they're talking about a piece of Canada, the James Bay Area, although very large, but still. I mean, why? I mean, can we? What is it about the James Bay Area that is attracting so much attention?
Well, I think there's different aspects. There's the inherent geology, and it is a continuation and part of the Abitibi, which is very well known as for its gold endowment. Val d'Or, Rwanda is one of the king places of copper way back in the Abitibi.
Yeah.
Val d'Or, by its name, Valley de l'Or, Valley of Gold, is really well endowed. But the James Bay is just that, historically it was further north, and so it wasn't as explored as much as the Abitibi. And the other element is with the Hydro-Quebec's power plant generation, hydroelectric plants, the Quebec government, in partnership with the Cree, the First Nations, developed the infrastructure, the roads. And so now you have that access, which is an important element. And so you add the access, the geology, you add the sort of social acceptance. I think there's been a sort of a good partnership between the Quebec and the First Nations, and understanding that you look at it, it's a win-win where we can develop our resources in partnership with the Cree. And so I think there's this sort of social ambiance that makes it sort of interesting, where there's in paix sociale, like you can go and work there, and as long as work is well done. But the most important thing is, I think, is the inherent geology, and so the James Bay, there is that sort of multi-commodity potential. There's some other parts in the world, obviously, that has it, but the James Bay is sort of put the fact that it's relatively recent in terms of its exploration history. We add the fact that about its access with the infrastructure, and then with its social um, security and peace. All that combined makes it that it's just perfect timing in terms of its recognition as a well endowed area.
Yeah, and we have a few companies, some key players now uh, that are in the James Bay Area. What is it that, if we're looking, is there something? I mean, do you look for something? I mean, we're just talking specifically about you. And naturally, everybody, has to do their
Yeah,
own
I mean, I
research
always
and
like
stuff like that. But
making a knowledge about, you're either the leader of the parade or you're a follower of the parade. And there's nothing wrong about following the parade, but I always appreciate as an analyst the companies that are able to lead the parade, because that means they were the ones that were able to understand the potential. They were the first movers.
okay,
And it's always a question of timing. But I always look at the management teams and what, who's behind it, and who is the composition of the technical team. And I always appreciate those who are able to think outside the box, and also the ones who are able to say, hey, look at, this is an area that maybe has not been well looked. We have some ingredients that suggest that it's worthwhile to go and look at that. And they're first movers. And so that's to me is always important. And there's some companies that will use closology. They'll see that, hey, this company claims stakes in that area. This company has a good reputation. Well, we're going to get the claims around there. And sometimes it's just a question that, well, they're just following the parade, basically, on
okay.
a closology story.
Do
And
you
when you
have
look at their
anyone?
disclosure later on, it's not that interesting.
And do you have any that you believe that are, sort of leaders in this space?
Well, there's a few companies I cover as analysts. There's Brunswick Exploration, which I think, kudos to Killian and his team, where they were the ones who recognized that for the pegmatites and lithium exploration, that we knew the historical deposits where they were, but they said, hey, maybe there's other ones, and let's do the look at the exploration potential, and let's just test these hypotheses. And they had, with their knowledge, they had these ideas where they're able to even focus even more inside of a district to say, hey, this probably is an interesting area for the good fertile type of pegmatites, LCT pegmatites. And so they really use their geological background to be able to pinpoint stuff. And their business is basically we're good explorers. We know what we're looking for, and they go in an area and they test things, and they're able to move quite quickly. And with a good, knowledgeable way of being able to say this is good, this is bad, they're able to be ahead of the parade and be the the sentinels on this. And so there's other companies also that um, just by their expertise in the area, because they were looking for gold since the last 10 years in the James Bay, said, look, we're experts in this area, and why not generate some projects, lithium projects, based on our knowledge of the area, and able to look at stuff and say, hey, maybe this is an interesting area, because, and I don't want to go into much details, but there's some teams that are able to come up with another optics and other hypothesis to look in this particular area, and they've had some success. So I mentioned Half-Line exploration. I mentioned Midland exploration. I think Azimuth exploration is another one. There's a few like that out there that were maybe not the leaders of the parade initially, but are strong enough to come up and do a variance or justify their playing into the lithium sector. And I always appreciate companies that are able to justify why they're looking for this commodity in this area at this particular time, as opposed to just saying we're just following the parade.
Oh, that's really interesting. And of course, naturally, we always tell everybody to do their own research and stuff like that. And
yeah, do your due diligence. I mean, I know it's not always simple, and even I, as an analyst, I mean, I miss stuff. I always, like I say, I enjoy discussions with more generalists, because I always like to say, I'm very well specialist and be able to tell you what is the type of bark of the tree, but sometimes I'm so close to the tree that I don't see the whole forest.
it's true. It's
So
true.
that's
It's
why I
like
always
that for
appreciate
everything.
people that have more of a general view. And so this is where I think I'll mention it. We have right now, in terms of the lithium industry, a lot of Australian companies, and you mentioned Australia that are looking at the James Bay,
So
but
true.
it is interesting because after the sellers in South America, the first sort of hard rock lithium plays were in Australia.
Yes,
And they
absolutely.
developed because they were maybe not too far from the Chinese market. So they could build up their lithium, their spodumene, and send
Yeah.
the concentrate to China and have it processed there. Um, and so that was sort of a closology in terms of they were able to ship their concentrate there and have it and build up their project. And this reminds me, I make a parenthesis here, of Nemaska. I mean, if Nemaska, they put a lot of emphasis on doing the transformation of their concentrate of spodumene into to lithium, and it's different sort of either do a lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide, but it was a more of an industrial process where it was not, I wouldn't say experimental, but had they been able to maybe initially just send their concentrate to China, I don't know if that would have been palpable for the Quebec population, but they put it sort of a high march to be able to attain. And if you're able to sort of start off, do your initial concentrate and find a market initially, maybe not get the full price of your product, but sometimes on a stage approach, that's maybe a good way to do it. So I think for me, what I learned with Nemaska is sometimes a stage approach is nothing wrong with that,
Yeah.
as opposed to trying to hit the home run rate on the onslaught, which, if you succeed, kudos to you, and you'll be a superstar, but most of the times you're better off with a strong single and then do hope for a double and then eventually get the home plate.
Yeah.
But
And
again, there's no perfect recipe and there's no perfect timing. And so it's one that you have to take case by case. But as an investor, it's good to yes, effectively do your due diligence, know who the people behind that, and try to go with the teams that are leading the parade.
that's so
That's what
true. And what I like about the whole closology in the when we're talking about Australia and China, because of processing and all this kind of stuff, when we look at what Quebec is investing, Ontario is investing, we're looking at pretty much battery parks, right? I mean, like that are that are being built. So our infrastructure is just at its very beginning, and it's not like we're missing out on cars here. I mean, the EV industry was going to replace the ICE vehicles, and we're talking about an industry that is at its very beginnings. I think that when a lot of people say, "Oh no, like this is over or it's been played out," I'm just like, how is that even possible? I mean, we're just starting in this space here. Yeah, sure, maybe places like Norway are ahead of the game over there, But when you look at Canada, United States, even most of Europe, I mean, we're just starting. And
I totally agree, Albert. And you mentioned Norway. I just make a tongue in cheek where, Norway um, developed its oil fields in the Barents, I shouldn't say the Barents Sea, in North Atlantic, Northwest Atlantic. They developed their oil fields, and they did it in such a way that was smart, where they did a sovereign fund, and that sovereign fund permitted to divest and develop other elements. But it reminds me that, it's important as for governments never to close the door on a certain industry,
I agree.
and be open to it, and make sure that when you have the door open, that you maximize um, the elements of this industry, because these things will always contribute in some ways or another. And I think for me, Norway is a case in point example where they didn't close the door on the oil and gas. They just fine tweaked it to get the maximum of it, and that permitted to
Yeah.
divest into different other industries. And here I'm making reference to the Quebec situation, where unfortunately the Quebec government said no to oil and gas exploration, which I think is a sad element. We said no to uranium. I think again here we'll see how the nuclear energy evolves, but I mean I kind of find it sad that we used the Fukushima incident to say that that was a dangerous industry and that we should end it right there. I mean, it was an exceptional circumstance of a I think it was an 8.2 earthquake, which is tremendously strong. And I think had it happened here in Quebec, it would have flattened any structure. But unfortunately, that nuclear power station had a rise in temperature, and then you had that tsunami that even compounded even more the problem. Anyways,
Yeah.
what I want to convey over here is that it's important never to say never to a commodity, because who knows if one's treasure one day will not, or one's garbage one day will become one's treasure some other day. So here again, for governments, I think it's important to, yes, go towards greening of our economy, but don't spit on our base metal industry or oil and gas industry, because those are still part of our economic mix, but have a track record that they've been able to weather the storms and make us where we are today in such a way that is more modern, if you want.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, thank you so much for being on Between Play Stock Market Strategies. We'd like to be able to extend an invitation to you to be on the show again in the future.
It was a pleasure, Albert, and interesting conversations we could have. And I think the most important thing is to have that interest of knowing what's going on, and
Yeah.
realization that commodities have an important part in our society today, and be curious. And here I'm making reference to the youth that listen to where things come from, and it is fascinating. There's always a cost to go get these things, but it is fascinating to know, where did this nickel come from, and how was it produced, and where the cobalt was produced, and where it comes from, what type of rocks. And then once you start to have these little bit of knowledge, and I think as when we did our site visit, you know, your
Yes.
little curiosity permitted you to lead to say, hey, well, I remember this. And so it's
Yeah.
always interesting to have that sort of ouverture d'esprit that permits you
Yes.
to be able eventually to tie in things. And look, I might sound like a specialist, but I'm always learning also. And I'm the first one to say that the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know much.
Oh,
So
that
it's
is so
always good
true.
to learn and keep our perspective ouvert, if we want.
Yes, that's so true. And just so that you know, yes, I brought back the rocks and I showed my kids some of the iron in there and stuff like that that you had, taught me to look for,
Yeah.
to tell them. And they have those rocks
And if
on
I
their
recall that, I
windowsills.
also told you to bring a little tree, a little
Yes,
sapling.
I planted it too.
Excellent.
I
Yeah.
planted that too. It's so in Terracotta Park. I didn't plant it on my land. I planted it in a park with a ton of other trees, but it's in the sun. It's not in the shade, and I go and check on it all the time. I put this little thing around it, and it's growing. And I can't wait
Yeah.
to see
No,
it next year and the year
I mean,
after.
I enjoy doing that because first of all, you're spreading trees, and it's, these things will grow. And I remember when I visited the Renard diamond mine in northern Quebec, I had taken a few samples of kimberlites, and I had also taken a little spruce tree, and I planted it. Initially, it was small like that with the rocks around, the big rocks around, and I protected it. But I had to retransplant it because it was higher than me. So it just shows you that these things do grow. And
Yes.
I think, there's ways of combining, commodities with greening, and it's
Oh
win-win
yeah,
for everybody. Because
absolutely.
it always goes back to Mother Earth. And
Yeah.
here I just want to make a final parenthesis because Mother Earth does play us tricks, and Mother Earth has a lot of types of children. And like we have each human, we have a head, two arms, a legs in general, and we can define a human as being like that. And it's very mundane, it's very simplistic, but each human is original. Each human being is original by its personality, by its facial attributes. Even two
True.
twins that are identical, people will be able to differentiate them. So
So
what I
true.
want to get that in terms of getting back to mineral deposits, that each deposit is original, is different, and so that adds that complexity.
It's
So
amazing.
it's fascinating. Our industry is fascinating in that regards, where mineral deposits, we can simplify them, make generalities, but each one of them has its little specifics, and so it just adds more spice to the life of a mining analyst and to the life of an investor.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you so much, Eric. Really
It was a
appreciate it.
pleasure, Albert,
Right.
and au revoir, as we say.
Thank you. And just for all the listeners out there, always remember to research, prepare, plan, execute, and see you next time. Thank you.